You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Gill Paul.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, click on the links in the right-hand sidebar to subscribe to the show. I'd like to thank some sponsors for making today's show possible. First off is George Weir with his book Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky series. Jim is an orphan living in the floating city of Cirrus. As the dreaded Horn attack, Jim and his friends are scooped up in an adventure of a lifetime when the floating orphanage Janus is destroyed. Not only must Jim, Crowan, and a mech named Goat survive aboard a Horn capital ship, but they must find a way to save each other and all of Sky. In order to do so, Jim and his friends soon find themselves in the crosshairs of the two greatest fleets ever assembled, with a battle coming that may bring nightfall upon Earth forever. But there's a hope and a well-kept secret buried beneath a mountain far below in the land left devastated by the 200-year-old Holocaust. Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky by George Weir. There's a link to it in the show notes. And thanks to Patricia Gilliam for sponsoring the show. Her book, Out of the Gray, which is the first book in the Honaria series. You really want to pick this up. Aliens, Politics, and Murder. Only the first one is new. This is such a fantastic series, and you can get in on the beginning of the series right now with Book 1, Out of the Gray. The Honaria series is one of my favorite series from one of my favorite writers. You're really going to love what Patricia's doing. Thank you to Patricia for sponsoring the show. Also, at the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Gill Paul on the show with me today. She has a brand new book out here in the States. It's been out over in the UK for a little while already, but this book is phenomenal, and I think you guys are really going to love it. It's called Another Woman's Husband from the #1 bestselling author of The Secret Wife. And Gill Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
I'm excited to have you. Gill, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
When I was about 8 years old, I used to produce a magazine, which I distributed to the neighbours, and each one of them was handwritten. It would have a story, a poem, a joke, and you can imagine what kind of jokes there were from an 8-year-old, probably pretty awful, and maybe a little puzzle. And I didn't have any copying facilities, but I would hand do copies for about 6 or 7 neighbours. And I did that fairly regularly for a while. And so I always thought I'd go into journalism or work for a magazine or something. Nobody, by the way, has kept a single copy of any of these magazines that I made. So they must have been really terrible, you know, what 8-year-olds write like. But yeah, that was the first inkling and I was also a passionate reader from an early age. Possibly if you'd asked me back then, I would also have said if there was a job where you got to sit and read books all day, I would do that.
What sorts of books did you love?
I loved mystery stories. I loved the Nancy Drew mysteries, completely hooked on them, read every single one. And witches, fairies, and then I got a taste for Agatha Christie quite early, you know, that kind of working out who the murderer was,
right.
Which weapon he used. And then I got into historical novels after that.
Which is very similar in a lot of cases to an Agatha Christie novel, where you're trying to work out what the real truth is behind what maybe we think we know.
Yeah, no, well, I now write historical novels, although fairly recent history, early 20th century mostly, and there's different ways of approaching historical fiction. You can take great liberties if you want to. There are no rules. It's fiction. So if you want to say that Abraham Lincoln was a vampire or Hitler won the Second World War, then you can do that. But the way I approach it is I try to stick very closely to the historical facts. in the characters that I'm writing about, but get behind the facts and imagine what it might have felt like to be them, going through the experiences that they went through. So at the end of the book, I'll put in a little historical afterwards saying which bits are true and which bits I completely made up, just so that I'm not trying to falsify history in any way.
Oh, that's amazing. What first got you excited about history and telling these stories? Not only do you write historical fiction, but you've also written some nonfiction. But what was it about these stories and these actual happenings that got your imagination going and made you want to kind of focus in this area?
To write, well, my mum has to have the credit for getting me interested in history because she was passionate about it. And we used to sit, I don't know what it's like here, but I live in the UK. On Sunday nights, there was always a big historical drama, and we would sit and watch these together, usually, several parts. You get very involved in the plot. We also read a lot of historical biographies together and passed them one to the other. We continued to do that for, years until recently. And I studied history at university. I had a long university career for lots of complicated reasons because I started off studying medicine, but then I realized it wasn't for me, and I switched into the arts and studied history at university and just carried on from there. I've always just been fascinated in what it was like to live in different periods. I love historical buildings. I love vintage historical clothing.
What was the first novel that you wrote that got published?
Oh gosh, it was terrible. I can remember to say that. It was back in 2000. It was a novel called Enticement, and it was a kind of historical time slip. It had a modern day plot and a plot in occupied France in the Second World War. And when I look back now, it's 18 years ago. I hope I've improved as a writer since then, because I can't believe it. But it did get published. It was published in the UK by Hodder, which is quite a big publisher. They're part of the Hachette Group. But yeah, no, I don't ever go back and read that now. I think it was like my training novel where I was learning my craft. Let's be kind. Please don't go out and buy it.
What historical periods have you focused on?
In my more recent novels, I love the just before the First World War, that whole very innocent era. I mean, society was changing. Religion was losing its importance. People were starting to get divorced, although it was still a huge taboo. So I like that. I also like Between the Wars, just for the amount of change happening in society. Women's position in society in particular was just changing radically. Women were going out, middle-class women were going out and getting jobs, so that made a huge difference to their lives. And I've kind of flipped around different areas and events. Usually the spark for a novel for me quite often comes from a footnote in a history book that I'm reading. And I think, that's interesting. And you kind of wander down the rabbit hole and find out what you can, and a story hopefully will leap out of the research. That's the route I go. So it's footnote, rabbit hole, research.
I love that. I don't know if you knew this. I'm sure you did. That we here in the States kind of have this love of British culture and English culture, and we like to spout off about our independence and all that, and then everyone in the States is crowded around the television to watch Downton Abbey or to watch some royal wedding. It's really kind of funny, the fascination that we have with this whole idea of royalty and the class system, and it's so when you talk about that period of right before World War I and how things are changing, that was really fascinating for me to watch as we watched Downton Abbey, and then to start reading some historical accounts and really understand how the entire culture was shifting and turning over, and I think it's a fascinating period. Do you being on that side of the Atlantic and being immersed in this, are those things just commonplace, or do British citizens still get as fascinated as we do with the whole idea of this system that is now, modernizing and changing?
The class system, it really is much less relevant than it was in the early 20th century. I think,
Sure.
Clearly we still have titled people, and they live quite normal lives, many of them. They can't afford to keep up the stately home, so they might have a job or have paying guests coming in to help with the upkeep of it. But I think the aristocracy exists, but they're just less influential in society. And I don't think you can walk into a job based on talent now, rather based on who you know. Although the old school tie still works to an extent. If you look at British politics, most of the people at the top have come through the public school system. In Britain, we call it public school when it's a fee-paying school. That their parents have paid an arm and a leg to get them there. So that most politicians in Britain still come in through that level, and Oxbridge University, Oxford or Cambridge. But it's changing fast. But there is the fascination with the monarchy. And everybody's been completely glued to The Crown, for example. It's just the best series ever. I love it.
It is fantastic.
There's a mystique about the monarchy. They don't, other monarchies around Europe, and there are several of them, but the Dutch Queen will cycle down to the supermarket and buy her own groceries. Our royals don't do anything like that. They're very much behind closed doors. You don't know entirely what's going on. And that's what makes The Crown so fascinating, because it's giving us a glimpse. Who knows if it's true or not, but they try to base it on facts and then just embroider behind the scenes. So they're wonderful. And everybody was so excited about the royal wedding, Meghan and Harry, this year. I was there commentating on historical royal weddings for the BBC World Service. So I was sitting just across the road from the St George's Chapel and watching out the window and commenting on what was happening and talking a bit about the history of royal weddings there, which was fantastic. It was a great honour and really exciting to be there.
Well, it has to be one of those surreal moments that you've been writing books and you've been following the footnotes and falling down the rabbit holes, and one day that leads to an opportunity to share a lot of those little nuggets that you've dug out, probably.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful, so great. And of course, when you're working on radio, we were in a studio opposite the castle, so I was seeing everybody's backs as they went in. There was George Clooney walking in, and I was waving, "George, turn around," but he didn't. But when they came out and they rode in the carriage, we had a very good view then from our window, so that was great.
I bet. You talked about the process of footnote, rabbit hole, and research. When you're doing that, how much liberty do you give yourself to stray from the known narrative, and how do you construct a fictional story around these events, and keep it believable while having that air of what might be?
Right. I think what keeps it believable is lots of little details, not weighing the story down, but being accurate in, if a character's taking an aspirin for a headache, get the right kind of aspirin, have them eating the right kind of food or wearing the right clothes, down to tiny details, the shoe buckles or whatever. And then after that, it's a story. It's not a history lesson. It's got to be an entertaining story that people want to read. But for me, I think finding the right amount of little authentic details can help. And that's the way I go about it.
Your newest book, Another Woman's Husband, has been out, I think it came out last year in the UK, didn't it?
It did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it came out for the 20th anniversary of Diana dying last August in 2017, yeah.
20 years. That is,
I know.
That is crazy. I remember as a kid, I guess because I was around middle school, watching the wedding, between Diana and Prince Charles. And I remember my mother just, being, so ecstatic about it and watching it in the middle of the night. And then as a grown person and my wife and I were married, and our daughter, she was pregnant with our daughter at the time, and we watching the news coverage of when Diana died, and this kind of, realizing that almost all of my formative years, this story was kind of active and part of, my growing up. And in talking about that fascination with the TV series The Crown, these are things that we kind of make signpost in our life as we follow these people that we don't really know, yet we kind of feel like we know. And then we see these details about their life and, sordid stories and in the, the magazines and things like that. And we feel like we have a window into them. Why did you choose, Diana as the kind of the focal point of this book?
Well, for this novel, I'd long wanted to write about Wallace Simpson, and I was looking for an angle because I tend to write time slips, so I have a modern plot and an older plot and weave them together. And then I came across this strange fact that Diana visited Wallace's home in Paris hours before she died in 1997, and nobody's entirely sure why she was there. Dodi's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, claims that they were engaged and that they were thinking of living there, but none of Diana's friends believe that at all. She'd only been dating Dodi for a few weeks, and she was having a good time, but there was, she wasn't crazy enough to get engaged to somebody she'd only known for a few weeks. They only stayed 28 minutes in the house, and she remained in the office downstairs all that time, so it's not as if she was looking around. No, there had to be another reason why she was there. And that started me thinking about the similarities, the things that Wallace and Diana had in common. Because they both married into the same family. Diana's husband, Charles, was the great-nephew of the Duke of Windsor. They both had difficult childhoods, single-parent childhoods. They both were fashion icons. They both had eating disorders. And they were both hounded by the press at different times in their life. So I wondered whether they did actually ever meet, because Diana married Charles in 1982 and Wallace was alive till 86. We know that Charles was in touch with Wallace. So there is a chance they could have met. And I decided to weave a story around this and to find an explanation for why Diana was at Wallace's house, the Villa Windsor, that day that she died.
I know I've heard the name Wallace Simpson, but who was this character?
Wallace Simpson was an American woman who married 3 times altogether, but she was married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, when she arrived in London in the 1930s, moving in very elite sets, and she met the Prince of Wales. Now, David, as he was known then, was a playboy type who hadn't settled down, even though he was by then 40. He'd never chosen the bride or produced the heirs, and he was direct heir to the throne. So when his father died in January 36, he became King Edward VIII. By that time, he was deeply involved in his affair with Wallace, but he was unable to marry her constitutionally because she was a divorcee. In fact, she was divorced from her first husband on grounds of emotional incompatibility, which is not accepted, or it was not then accepted as a reason for divorce in the Church of England. So in their eyes, she was still married to her first husband. There's no way she could marry a king of England who was to be head of the church. They tried to find different solutions for this and couldn't. And in the end, in December 1936, Edward gave up his throne to be with the woman he loved rather than carry on. And, it's been suggested she could just stay his mistress and he could marry somebody else, as kings and monarchs have done through the ages, time-honoured fashion. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be married to the woman that he loved, and he gave up his throne for her. And after that, they weren't allowed to stay in Britain anymore. They moved to France, and then they were in the Bahamas during the Second World War, and then lived in Paris the rest of their lives. So it's called the abdication crisis in Britain. It was a huge scandal, and it really damaged the monarchy at the time. That's another thing that Wallace had in common with Diana, because, Diana's death and the way that her divorce from Charles, her death, and then the way that the monarchy responded to it caused damage to them at the institution at the time.
Well, yeah, and we watched that whole drama play out in the first season of The Crown with the abdication of the throne and how Queen Elizabeth came to power, and that's such a scandalous thing for the time.
Huge scandal, absolutely huge. Yeah. The Crown wasn't very kind to Wallace and Edward. In fact, they, particularly during the war years, they did some very dodgy things in terms of communicating with the Germans, thinking that they might help to make peace. I mean, it's alleged that Edward gave away some wartime secrets that he'd been party to his German counterparts, which, you know, he wasn't the most intelligent man on the planet. Let's just leave it there. And of course, they both went and met Hitler and were famously photographed with Hitler in 1937, when most sensible people would have stayed away.
Yes, and that probably would have been the best idea. But you know, but who are we to Monday morning quarterback that? So you've got these two great characters. You've got Wallace, you've got Princess Diana, who both caused major waves in the status quo and brought a certain watchful eye on the goings on, and the ability to weave these two people together in this really interesting story. Was that an aha moment for you when you came across that footnote that, I've got these two differing stories in my mind. This is the linchpin that can bring them together? Yeah. And there's a couple of other things that I've used, in the novel to bring them together. And I tried to weave the story. I plan my stories really, really carefully. That was going to be my next question, yeah.
Before I start, I've got an outline that's usually about 35,000 words, something like that, about a third of the length of the book as a whole.
Wow,
in which
that's a serious outline.
I've planned what's going to happen in each chapter. I haven't written the dialogue or the descriptions or the background or anything like that, but I know what's going to happen in each chapter, and I usually stick quite closely to it because I'm trying to get each plot to reflect on each other at certain points. I want them to meet up at certain points and then come together in the end when the mystery is revealed. So yes, no, there are some novelists who, some novelists who plot very carefully, and the others who just start at the beginning and fly by the seat of their pants. I'm a plotter on that scale.
How long does it take you to put together that 30,000 word outline?
Well, I'll start with the research, and that takes several months. It depends whether it's a period that I'm particularly familiar with or if I'm going into areas and learning about areas that are new to me. But usually the research will take 4 or 5 months. Then the outline I'll do quite quickly, maybe 2 months after that. And then I'll send that out and get opinions from my editor, my agent, and a couple of other readers that I trust, that I always go to every time. Bless them, they're fantastic. And only after that will I start at, page 1, line 1, first word of the novel, and get going then. And the writing, I would say, after that will take another 6 months, maybe. And then I'll do loads of editing. So I'm quite slow. I know there are people who write 3 or 4 novels a year, but 1 a year is the most I can manage, and sometimes not quite that.
Yeah. Well, when it's as dense with details and with every page has a nugget there that is enlightening, those things take time. They just do.
I was sticking very closely to the timelines with Another Woman's Husband, so it's the timeline of Wallace's life from 1911 when she met her school friend Mary Kirk. They met at summer camp, in fact, up to 1936 with the abdication crisis. So I look at Wallace through Mary's eyes during those years because I wanted to give a different view of her from the normal. A lot of biographers, particularly male biographers, have got very caught up in the scandals of supposed affairs that Wallace had, and she spent some time in China, and they claim that she went to Chinese brothels and learned tricks from the women that worked there, and that's how she managed to captivate a king's heart. And to me, I wanted to know more about the woman and what made her the way she was, her vulnerabilities. So I decided to view her through the eyes of her school friend, Mary Kirk. And their lives were very intertwined from 1911 up to the abdication crisis. And that's the way I approached that. But at the same time, I was working on a very tight timeline with the Diana plot because it opens on the 30th of August 1997 with a couple driving to Paris in a taxi who've just got engaged, and they come upon the scene of the crash in the Alma Tunnel. And he's a TV producer and decides to make a documentary about the crash and see what he can find out. Because straight away, I don't know if you remember this, there were conspiracy theories.
Yes.
Loads of people. The British public were polled, 85% of them thought that there was something dodgy, some conspiracy had gone on behind the crash. They couldn't accept it was a random accident by a drunk driver in a grotty concrete tunnel. And I think there's plenty of people who still won't accept that. So that plot I started on the night Diana died, and it just ran up to December 97, going through this producer investigating the crash and trying to find out what happened, and also looking at the emotional reaction to Diana's death. And I think that was quite huge in the States as well, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
In London, we had this sea of flowers around Kensington Palace, and then people sobbing in the street, grown men sobbing during her funeral. It was quite extraordinary.
It is. Having these dual timelines and dual plots that you are weaving together throughout the whole story, I'm assuming that is part of your outlining process, that as you're going, you're looking at the road markers on the map to your destination at the end, and and weaving them together, looking at places where you can bring out the maximum drama, maximum keeping us on the edge of our seat in the writing.
I hope so. That's what I'm aiming for. Yeah, just to keep. It's got to be. Historical accuracy is very important to me in my work, but the main thing is to write an entertaining story and keep people wanting to read the next page.
Right, exactly. Well, the book is fascinating. It hits all those notes of nostalgia and the curiosity that we have of what's going on behind the scenes that we aren't privy to. Another Woman's Husband, it's out everywhere in hardback and Kindle edition and audiobook. Gill, if people are just discovering you and your work, where might they find you online to get plugged into all you do?
I am really easy to find online. I'm all over the place. I've got a website, www.gillpaul.com. I've got Twitter is Gill Paul Author, Facebook is Gill Paul Author, and Instagram, I can't remember, but I am on Instagram as well. So I'm very easy to find. And I love hearing from readers, by the way. I'll always respond if you get in touch with me. And I also do FaceTime and Skype calls to book groups. If you've got a book group that's reading one of my titles, then I'd be happy to pop up, and my face will pop up in the middle of your book group.
Oh, how wonderful. And Gill is spelled with a G.
It is, yes.
Yes.
G-I-L-L, and then Paul, P-A-U-L. I think with my funny English pronunciation, it's not always very clear.
Gill, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. We're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of Another Woman's Husband. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, it's been lovely to chat with you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason ate Thanksgiving dinner alone at the Horseman restaurant. He had the place to himself. Everyone else had somewhere to be. He picked at his burger and fries, thinking of meals past. Thanksgiving had always been Eliza's favorite holiday, as Halloween had always been his. Jason glanced at the menu propped at his elbow. The horseman with his hand held high, carrying a tray with burgers and a shake. The horseman he'd seen on Halloween was no cartoon. That horseman was a thing of crematorium ash, of grave clothes and withered grass, riding a horse of autumn leaves and snail shells and pieces of skull. Jason's hand rose to the tender stripe of skin on his neck. The hatchet cut. "You okay, honey?" Jennifer, the waitress, appeared at his elbow. She had dyed her hair since he'd first met her. A pink stripe ran through the gray now, as if she had stuck her head in a cotton candy machine. "Yeah, I'm full." She raised an eyebrow. "That bad, huh?" Jason glanced at his plate, still piled with food. "Just not hungry. You know, I saw the Headless Horseman once, said Jennifer, refreshing Jason's cup. She glanced about, deciding something. She set the pot down on a nearby table and slid into Jason's booth with some difficulty, sucking her belly in. "I've seen him," she whispered. "Just like you." "When?" "Oh, 10 years ago." Jason glanced around to see if the cooks or busboys were watching, to see if she was playing a prank. "Where?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "East of here. Sam and I used to live out on Sawmill River Road. I worked at my daddy's Applebee's franchise, you know? It's still there. Daddy sold it, though. It was around Halloween time and I was coming off shift. It had been a night, believe me. Parties of like 20. We sang to the little brats, 'Happy, happy birthday' from all of us at Applebee's." "The Horseman?" "Right." She produced cigarettes. "Do you mind?" Jason shook his head. "Thanks. Don't tell the smoke police." Jason slid the saucer from beneath his coffee mug to serve as an ashtray. It was about midnight, probably. I counted my tips. And those little bastards stiff you, by the by. So I wasn't in a good mood. I was waiting for Sam to pick me up. I was smoking in the parking lot, trying not to catch my hair on fire, and I heard this thunder, coming down the Picantico Hills from the direction of the hollow. Rumble, 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 but it was clear out, and the sound got closer and closer. We had a full moon that night, hanging over the top of the ridge, and I saw him come up the other side, this black shape on a horse, fast as the devil late for church. He was down the hill before I knew it, coming right at me, and he jumped Sawmill River, kaboom! And when he reached the parking lot, I saw. She drew one finger across her neck. Nothing. No head. And it wasn't any real horse, either. Too damn fast. He was in a hurry. Didn't even see me. Whoosh! My apron blew up. The dumpster started rolling. Car alarms. Blew out my damn cigarette. He shot across the field. Beeline, due east. Never saw anything like it. So... She patted Jason's hand. "I know you're getting laughed at. But not by me." She stubbed her cigarette in the saucer. "Some of us believe you."